What would you do if you found a diary that revealed a love story so powerful it could change your entire life? In the harsh wilderness of Wyoming Territory in 1875, a lone cowboy is about to discover that some secrets are worth more than gold, and some loves are worth crossing any distance to find. The wind howled across the desolate plains as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. For 30-year-old Jake Morrison, this abandoned cabin wasn't just shelter from the approaching blizzard. It was about to become the doorway to a mystery that would consume his thoughts and redirect his solitary path forever. What he found hidden beneath those creaking floorboards would prove that even in the loneliest corners of the frontier, love finds a way to endure. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The November wind cut through Jake Morrison's wool coat like a blade as he guided his weary horse, Thunder, across the snow-dusted Wyoming plains. Dark clouds churned overhead, promising a fierce blizzard that could trap a man for days, or kill him if he didn't find shelter soon. Jake had been riding alone for 3 weeks, moving cattle from the Rawlins area toward winter pastures near Cheyenne. At 30, he'd spent more than half his life in the saddle, preferring the company of horses and open sky to the complications that came with settling down. The solitary life suited him, or so he'd convinced himself after Sarah Fletcher had married the banker's son back in Colorado Springs 2 years ago. "Easy there, Thunder," Jake murmured as his horse's ears flicked nervously at the approaching storm. "We'll find something." Through the swirling snow, a dark shape emerged against the white landscape, a small log cabin nestled in a grove of bare cottonwoods. Smoke wasn't rising from the chimney, and no light flickered in the single window. Jake approached cautiously, his hand resting on his Colt .45. "Hello, the cabin," he called out, following frontier protocol. No answer came except the whistle of wind through the trees. Jake dismounted and led Thunder to a small lean-to shelter behind the cabin. The structure was weathered but solid, built by someone who knew how to work with their hands. He unsaddled his horse, making sure the animal was protected from the wind, then approached the cabin's front door. The heavy wooden door creaked open at his touch. Inside, the cabin was clean but clearly abandoned. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed comprising the sparse furnishings. Jake quickly set about building a fire, grateful for the dry wood stacked neatly beside the hearth. As flames began to crackle and cast dancing shadows on the log walls, Jake noticed something odd. Despite the cabin's abandoned state, everything was arranged with careful attention, as if someone had left expecting to return. A coffee pot sat ready on the stove, and a thick wool blanket was folded precisely at the foot of the bed. The storm hit with full fury as night fell. Jake prepared a simple meal from his supplies, listening to the wind rage outside while appreciating the solid walls that kept him safe. After eating, he explored the cabin more thoroughly by firelight. It was then he noticed the loose floorboard. Near the foot of the bed, one board sat slightly higher than the others. Jake knelt and pried it up with his knife, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather-bound journal and a small wooden box. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened the journal to the first page. Written in elegant script were the words, "The private thoughts of Elizabeth Catherine Hartwell, begun this 15th day of May, in the year of our Lord 1873. He turned the page and began to read. "Today I arrived at what will be my home for the next year. Papa thinks he's punishing me by sending me to teach at the settlement school in Medicine Bow, but he cannot know how grateful I am to escape Boston's suffocating parlors and endless social obligations. The cabin the town has provided is small but charming, and I find myself, for the first time in my 23 years, truly free." Jake found himself drawn into Elizabeth's world. Her writing revealed an intelligent, spirited woman who'd been exiled from Boston society for refusing to marry a man chosen by her father. Instead of despair, her words showed determination and joy at her newfound independence. As the storm raged outside, Jake read deep into the night, learning about Elizabeth's daily life, her struggles with the harsh frontier conditions, and her growing love for the wild beauty of Wyoming. But it was her entries about someone named Thomas that made Jake's heart race with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Thomas rode by the school today to check on the roof repairs. When he smiles, I forget every lesson Boston society taught me about proper behavior with men. There's something in his eyes, a kindness mixed with strength, that makes me feel as though I've been sleeping my entire life and am only now beginning to wake. Jake closed the journal as the fire burned low, his mind spinning with questions. Who was Elizabeth Hartwell? What had happened to her? And why did reading her private thoughts make him feel as though he'd been searching for her his entire life, without knowing it? Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. Jake would be trapped here for at least another day. Plenty of time to uncover more of Elizabeth's story. As he banked the fire and settled onto the bed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that finding this diary was more than mere chance. The wind whistled through the cabin's eaves like a voice calling from the past, and Jake Morrison, the man who'd spent years avoiding emotional entanglements, fell asleep clutching a stranger's diary to his chest. Jake woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside transformed into a crystalline wonderland. But the beauty of the snow-covered landscape couldn't compete with his eagerness to continue reading Elizabeth's diary. After tending to thunder and preparing coffee, Jake settled by the fire with the journal. The entries from summer 1873 painted a picture of a woman finding her place in the world. Elizabeth wrote about her students at the Medicine Bow School, her growing friendships with the settlement women, and her blossoming romance with Thomas Brennan, a young rancher who'd lost his parents in an Indian raid and was struggling to build a life from nothing. Thomas asked me to ride with him to check his cattle today. I should have declined. A proper lady doesn't spend unchaperoned time with a gentleman, but I find I care less each day about Boston's rules. We rode to a ridge overlooking his land, and he spoke of his dreams with such passion. He wants to build something lasting, a ranch that could support a family, a legacy for children not yet born. When he looked at me with those steady brown eyes, I felt as though he was asking a question my heart was desperate to answer. Jake paused in his reading, struck by the parallel between Thomas's dreams and his own abandoned hopes. Before Sarah's rejection, Jake had harbored similar ambitions, a spread of his own, a woman to share the work and the dreams. Reading about Thomas's courtship of Elizabeth stirred longings Jake thought he'd buried forever. The next entries chronicled a love story that bloomed against the harsh backdrop of frontier life. Elizabeth wrote about stolen kisses behind the schoolhouse, long walks under star-filled skies, and quiet conversations that stretched until dawn. Thomas, as depicted through Elizabeth's eyes, was everything a woman could want. Strong but gentle, ambitious but grounded, passionate but respectful. Then Jake reached the entry that changed everything. October 12, 1873. Thomas asked me to marry him today. We were sitting by Silver Creek, watching the aspens turn gold, when he took my hands and spoke the words I've been longing to hear. I said yes without hesitation, though I know the challenges we'll face. Papa will never approve of my marrying a frontier rancher with more dreams than dollars. But Thomas and I have agreed. We'll build our life together first, prove we can make it work, then face Papa's inevitable fury when we're strong enough to weather it. Thomas will spend the winter improving his ranch, and I'll finish my teaching contract. Come spring, we'll be married. Jake's coffee grew cold as he read Elizabeth's plans for her wedding, her detailed descriptions of the dress she was sewing in secret, and her dreams of the children she and Thomas would raise on their Wyoming ranch. Her happiness radiated from every word, making what Jake sensed was coming all the more tragic. The entries from late October and November grew shorter, more anxious. Thomas had stopped visiting as frequently, claiming he needed to focus on winter preparations. Elizabeth wrote of her growing worry, her attempts to convince herself that his distance was merely practical. Then came the entry that made Jake's chest tighten with dread. November 28, 1873. Mary Preston came to see me today with news that has shattered my world. Thomas was seen in Laramie City, escorting a young woman to the hotel dining room. Mary's cousin works at the hotel and overheard them discussing wedding plans. The woman wore an engagement ring, and Thomas introduced her as his fiancé. My Thomas, who kissed me just 2 weeks ago and promised we'd be together come spring, is apparently marrying someone else. I cannot breathe. I cannot think. How could I have been so foolish? Jake set the diary down, his hands clenched into fists. The bastard had betrayed her. Elizabeth's subsequent entries revealed her heartbreak in raw, painful detail. She wrote of sleepless nights, of putting on a brave face for her students while dying inside, of burning the wedding dress she'd sewn with such hope. But the final entries puzzled Jake. Instead of continued despair, Elizabeth's tone shifted to something approaching peace. December 15th, 1873. I've made my decision. Papa's latest letter demands my immediate return to Boston and threatens to disown me if I refuse to marry Mr. Whitmore, his business partner. I cannot, will not, return to that prison. Neither can I remain here, where every landmark reminds me of Thomas and the future we'll never share. I've accepted a position at a school in San Francisco. It's time for a fresh start, far from both Boston's constraints and Wyoming's painful memories. I leave tomorrow. The final entry was brief. December 16th, 1873. I'm packed and ready for the morning stage. If anyone ever finds this diary, know that I was happy here, despite how it ended. Wyoming gave me freedom and love, even if I couldn't keep both. Perhaps someday I'll return, when the pain has faded enough to let me remember the joy. Until then, I leave this cabin and these memories behind. H. Jake stared at the last page for a long time, Elizabeth's story burning in his mind. But questions remained. He picked up the wooden box he'd found with the diary and carefully opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed to Elizabeth in a bold masculine hand. All were unopened, their red wax seals intact. Jake's pulse quickened as he examined the return address. T. Brennan, Silver Creek Ranch, Wyoming Territory. With trembling fingers, Jake broke the seal on the earliest letter, dated December 10th, 1873. My dearest Elizabeth, I pray this letter finds you before you do something we'll both regret. Mary Preston told me what she said to you, and I must explain before it's too late. The woman in Laramie is my cousin Margaret, who arrived unexpectedly from Ohio. She's recently widowed and has nowhere else to go. I was helping her find lodging and work, nothing more. The ring she wore belonged to her late husband. I would never betray you, never betray us. Please, my darling, wait for me. I'm riding to town as soon as the weather clears to explain everything. Jake's hands shook as he opened letter after letter. Thomas had written every day for months, pouring out his love, his desperation, his growing fear that Elizabeth had left Wyoming believing the worst of him. The letters painted a picture of a man slowly going mad with grief and regret. One letter, dated March 1874, particularly struck Jake. Elizabeth, I've searched everywhere. The stage driver remembered you leaving for Denver, but the trail goes cold there. I've written to schools in San Francisco, Sacramento, even Los Angeles, but no one knows of Elizabeth Hartwell. If you're reading this, please know that not a day passes that I don't think of you. Don't regret that I wasn't faster to reach you with the truth. I was a fool to prioritize ranch work over the most important thing in my life, you. I love you still, and I always will. Your devoted Thomas. The last letter was dated just 3 months ago. My beloved Elizabeth, I don't know if you'll ever return to read these words, but I continue to hope. I've kept this cabin exactly as you left it, and I visit every week to leave another letter. I've built the ranch I promised you, made it something worthy of the life we planned together. I'm 35 now, still unmarried, still waiting. If you ever come back, even if you can't forgive me, please know that you were the greatest love of my life. The cabin will always be here, and so will I, Thomas. Jake sat in stunned silence as the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows. He now understood the meticulous care with which everything was maintained, the ready firewood, the sense that someone would return. Thomas Brennan had been keeping this place as a shrine to lost love for nearly 2 years. But the questions that burned in Jake's mind were practical ones. Was Elizabeth still alive? Had she ever learned the truth? And why did Jake Morrison, a man who'd sworn off romantic entanglements, feel compelled to find out? As evening approached and Jake prepared for another night in the cabin, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He would find Elizabeth Hartwell. He would reunite her with the man who'd never stopped loving her, never stopped hoping for her return. It was the right thing to do, Jake told himself. But deep in his heart, he knew there was another reason, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Elizabeth's words had awakened something in him, made him believe in love's possibility again. If he could help reunite two hearts that belonged together, maybe he could find his own way back to hope. Thunder whinnied softly from the lean-to, as if sensing his master's restless energy. Jake looked out at the star-filled Wyoming sky and made a silent promise to Elizabeth Hartwell and Thomas Brennan. He would not let their love story end in tragedy. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods like a benediction, and Jake Morrison began planning a journey that would test everything he believed about love, loyalty, and second chances. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Wyoming plains as Jake Morrison prepared to leave the cabin that had changed his life. He'd spent the night making careful notes from Elizabeth's diary and Thomas's letters, creating a timeline of events and gathering every clue that might help him find her. According to the diary, Elizabeth had planned to catch the Denver stage on December 17, 1873, then continue to San Francisco. It was now January 1876, more than 2 years later. The trail was cold, but Jake had tracked lost cattle across half the territory. Surely he could track one determined woman. After securing the diary and letters in his saddlebags, Jake mounted Thunder and rode toward Medicine Bow. If Elizabeth had taught at the settlement school, someone there might remember her destination or have received word from her since she left. The 20-mile ride gave Jake time to think about why he was doing this. The practical answer was simple. Reuniting two people who belonged together was the right thing to do. But as Thunder's hooves drummed against the frozen ground, Jake had to confront a more complicated truth. Reading Elizabeth's words had stirred something in him, an ache he'd tried to bury after Sarah's rejection. Maybe helping Elizabeth find happiness would somehow heal his own wounded heart. Medicine Bow was a typical frontier settlement, a main street lined with weathered buildings, a few dozen residents, and the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Jake tied Thunder to the hitching post outside Hannigan's General Store and pushed through the door, setting off a small bell. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a practical bun. She looked up from her ledger book with a welcoming smile. "Help you with something, stranger?" "I hope so, ma'am. I'm looking for information about someone who used to teach at the school here, Elizabeth Hartwell. Would have been about 2 years ago." The woman's expression immediately brightened. "Miss Elizabeth. Land sakes, I haven't heard that name in forever. Sweet girl, though too refined for this rough country. Are you family?" "No, ma'am. I'm investigating something on behalf of a friend." "Did you know her well?" "Well as anyone, I suppose. I'm Ruth Hannigan. My husband and I run this store, and Miss Elizabeth was one of our best customers. Always polite, always paid her bills on time. Shame what happened with that Brennan boy." Jake's pulse quickened. "What did you know about that situation?" Ruth glanced around the empty store, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "Well, it's old news now, but the whole town was talking about it. Miss Elizabeth and young Thomas Brennan were thick as thieves for months. Everyone expected them to announce their engagement. Then suddenly, Miss Elizabeth was packing to leave, and Thomas was riding around like a man possessed, asking everyone if they'd seen her." "Did you ever learn what happened between them?" "Not the whole truth, but I have my suspicions." Ruth lowered her voice. "My niece Mary, bless her heart, but she's got a mouth on her, came running to me all excited about seeing Thomas with some fancy woman in Laramie. She went straight to Miss Elizabeth with the tale. Looking back, I think Mary might have jumped to conclusions." "Why's that?" "Because a few days after Miss Elizabeth left, Thomas came storming into town demanding to know where Mary had gotten her information. Turns out the woman was his cousin from back east, recently widowed and looking for work. Thomas was fit to be tied when he realized what Mary had told Miss Elizabeth." Jake felt a surge of vindication for Thomas, mixed with frustration at the tragic misunderstanding. "Did Miss Elizabeth ever write to anyone here after she left?" "Not that I know of. She was private about her family back east, said they didn't approve of her coming west. Far as I know, nobody here ever heard from her again." "Do you remember anything about where she was headed?" Ruth pursed her lips, thinking. California, I believe. She mentioned teaching opportunities in San Francisco. Jim Morrison, he drives the Denver stage, might remember more details. He's usually at the Cattleman's Rest about this time of day. Jake thanked Ruth and walked down the street to the saloon. The Cattleman's Rest was a typical frontier drinking establishment. Rough wooden tables, a long bar, and the lingering smell of tobacco and whiskey. Despite the early hour, several men were already nursing drinks and playing cards. Jake approached the bartender, a burly man with a magnificent mustache. I'm looking for Jim Morrison, the stage driver. The bartender nodded toward a table in the corner, where a grizzled man in his 60s sat alone with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs. Jake introduced himself and explained his mission. Jim Morrison studied Jake with shrewd eyes. You're not the first person to ask about Miss Hartwell. Young Brennan's been here a few times over the years, hoping I'd remember something new. What can you tell me? Nice lady, scared but trying not to show it. Had 2 bags and a small trunk. Paid her fare to Denver and asked about connections to California. I remember because she was so different from most passengers, educated, well-spoken. You could tell she was running from something. Did she mention specific plans in California? Jim scratched his whiskers thoughtfully. She asked about schools in San Francisco. Said she'd heard there were opportunities for teachers. But here's the thing. When we got to Denver, she didn't board the California stage. Last I saw her, she was talking to the ticket agent about eastbound routes. Jake's heart sank. Eastbound? Back toward the States? That's what it looked like to me. Could be she changed her mind about California, decided to go home instead. This revelation complicated everything. If Elizabeth had returned east, she could be anywhere. Boston with her family, married to the man her father had chosen, or teaching in any of dozens of cities between Denver and the Atlantic coast. Jake spent the rest of the day in Medicine Bow, talking to anyone who remembered Elizabeth. The picture that emerged was of a woman beloved by her students, respected by the community, but ultimately too refined for the harsh realities of frontier life. Everyone spoke fondly of her, and several people mentioned seeing Thomas Brennan's desperate searches after she left. As the sun began to set, Jake made his way to Silver Creek Ranch, following directions Ruth Hannigan had provided. He needed to meet Thomas Brennan face to face, to understand the man whose letters had revealed such devotion and pain. The ranch was larger than Jake had expected. A well-built log house, several outbuildings, and extensive corrals that spoke of prosperity and hard work. Thomas had clearly fulfilled his promise to build something worthy of the woman he loved. Jake rode up to the house, just as a man emerged from the barn. Even in the fading light, Jake could see this was Thomas Brennan, tall, lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years under the western sun. But it was his eyes that struck Jake most forcefully. They held the kind of deep sadness that came from carrying hope too long. Help you with something, Thomas called out, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, a cautious but not unfriendly gesture. Jake dismounted slowly, his hands visible. Thomas Brennan? My name's Jake Morrison. I need to talk to you about Elizabeth Hartwell. The change in Thomas was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale, and he took a step forward, his eyes suddenly blazing with intensity. What about Elizabeth? Do you know where she is? Is she all right? The raw pain in Thomas's voice confirmed everything Jake had read in the letters. This was a man still deeply in love, still hoping against hope for a miracle. I found her diary, Jake said quietly. And your letters. All of them. Thomas staggered as if he'd been struck. Her diary? Where? How? In the cabin. The one you've been maintaining for her. I took shelter there during the storm 3 days ago. For a long moment, Thomas just stared at Jake, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, without warning, he sank down onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. She read them, he whispered. All this time I hoped, but she read them and still didn't come back. Jake sat down beside him. No, Thomas. She never read them. The letters were all still sealed when I found them. Thomas's head snapped up. What do you mean? Elizabeth left before your first letter arrived. She's never been back to the cabin. She doesn't know the truth about your cousin, doesn't know you've been waiting for her. The hope that flooded Thomas's face was painful to witness. Then she might not hate me? According to her diary, she loved you completely. She left because she thought you betrayed her, not because she stopped loving you. Thomas stood up abruptly, energy coursing through him. Then I have to find her. I have to tell her the truth. That's why I'm here, Jake said. I want to help you find her. Thomas studied Jake's face in the gathering darkness. Why? You don't know us. Why would you care about our story? Jake was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. Because some love stories deserve a happy ending. Because I've seen what happens when good people give up on each other over misunderstandings. And because he paused, surprised by his own honesty. Because reading her words reminded me what it feels like to believe in love. Thomas extended his hand, and Jake shook it firmly. When do we start? First light tomorrow. But Thomas, you need to know, the trail's cold. It's been over 2 years, and there's evidence she might have gone east instead of west. Finding her won't be easy. Thomas's grip tightened. I don't care if I have to search every city between here and the Atlantic Ocean. I won't give up on her again. As Jake prepared to spend the night at Thomas's ranch, he felt a strange mixture of determination and melancholy. He was committed to helping these two people find their way back to each other, but part of him wondered what would happen to his own heart when the search was over. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human hopes and dreams. But Jake Morrison had learned something important in that cabin. Some things were worth fighting for, even if you weren't sure what you'd find at the end of the search. Tomorrow, the real journey would begin. 6 weeks later, Jake Morrison stood on a train platform in Chicago, his breath forming clouds in the bitter February air. The search for Elizabeth Hartwell had taken him and Thomas Brennan from Denver to St. Louis, from Kansas City to Cincinnati, following a trail of half-remembered faces and yellowed school records. They'd almost given up twice. In St. Louis, a school administrator thought he remembered hiring a teacher named Elizabeth from Wyoming, but it turned out to be Elizabeth Hamilton, not Hartwell. In Cincinnati, they'd spent a week investigating a private academy that employed several women from the Western Territories, only to learn that none matched Elizabeth's description. But Jake's years of tracking lost cattle had taught him patience and persistence. Every dead end brought them closer to the truth, and Thomas's unwavering determination kept them both going when hope seemed foolish. The breakthrough had come in Indianapolis, at a boarding house frequented by traveling teachers. The proprietress, Mrs. Catherine Wells, remembered Elizabeth clearly. Such a lovely girl, she'd said, but so sad. She stayed here for nearly a month in early 1874, writing letters she never sent and staring out the window like she was looking for someone who'd never come. Mrs. Wells had provided the crucial information. Elizabeth had taken a position at Miss Porter's Academy for young ladies in Chicago, using the name Elizabeth Catherine Hart, her middle name and a shortened version of her surname. Now, as Jake waited on the platform while Thomas spoke with the academy's headmistress, he tried to calm his own racing heart. After weeks of searching, they were finally close. But what would they find? Had Elizabeth married? Had she built a new life that Thomas's reappearance would only complicate? Thomas emerged from the academy's imposing brick building, his face a mixture of hope and anxiety. She's here, he said simply. She's been teaching here for almost 2 years. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Did you see her? No. Miss Porter, the headmistress, said Elizabeth is in class until 4 o'clock. She teaches literature and music to the older girls. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. Jake, what if she doesn't want to see me? What if she's moved on? Then you'll have your answer, Jake replied gently. But if you don't try, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering. They waited in a coffee shop across from the academy, Thomas too nervous to eat, Jake trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. At 10 minutes past 4, Jake nudged Thomas and pointed toward the academy's front entrance. A group of young women emerged, chattering and laughing as they headed home for the day. Behind them came the teachers, several middle-aged women in dark dresses and practical coats. And then, stepping into the pale winter sunlight, Jake saw her. Even from across the street, Elizabeth Hartwell was unmistakable. She was exactly as her diary had suggested, elegant despite her simple dress, moving with a grace that spoke of good breeding and inner strength. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd faced disappointment and emerged stronger. But it was the sadness in her posture that struck Jake most forcefully. Even at this distance, he could see that the vibrant, hopeful woman from the diary entries had been replaced by someone who'd learned to guard her heart carefully. Thomas stood frozen, his coffee cup trembling in his hands. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "Even more beautiful than I remembered." Elizabeth paused on the academy steps, adjusting her gloves and looking up at the overcast sky. For a moment, her gaze seemed to sweep across the street, and Jake held his breath, wondering if she might somehow sense Thomas's presence. "Go to her," Jake urged. "She's right there." But Thomas seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the moment. What if she doesn't forgive me? What if she's happy here and I'm just disrupting her life? Jake stood up and placed a firm hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Look at her. Really look at her. Does she look happy to you?" Thomas studied Elizabeth's face across the street. Even from this distance, her loneliness was palpable. The way she held herself slightly apart from the other teachers, the careful control of her expression, the sense that she was going through the motions of a life rather than truly living it. "She looks—" Thomas paused, swallowing hard. "She looks the way I feel." "Then stop wasting time and go tell her the truth." Thomas nodded, squared his shoulders, and walked out of the coffee shop. Jake followed at a distance, his own heart pounding as he watched the scene unfold. Elizabeth had begun walking down the street, her steps measured and purposeful. Thomas called out to her when he was still 20 feet away. "Elizabeth!" She stopped dead, her back rigid. For a long moment, she didn't turn around. When she finally did, Jake saw her face go white with shock. "Thomas!" Her voice carried across the street, barely audible. "Thomas, is that really you?" Thomas approached slowly, his hands extended in a gesture of peace. "It's me, Elizabeth. I've been looking for you for 2 years." Jake watched from across the street as Elizabeth struggled to maintain her composure. Her hands flew to her throat, and she took a step backward. "How did you find me? Why are you here?" "I found your diary," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. "And you found my letters, or you would have if you'd ever come back to the cabin." "Letters?" Elizabeth's confusion was evident even from Jake's distant vantage point. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a packet of envelopes. 3 dozen letters, Elizabeth. I wrote to you every week for months, trying to explain what really happened. The woman you saw me with in Laramie, she was my cousin Margaret, recently widowed. I was helping her find work and lodging, nothing more. Elizabeth stared at the letters, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Your cousin." She was wearing her dead husband's ring, Elizabeth. "Mary Preston saw us together and assumed the worst. I never betrayed you, never stopped loving you. I've been waiting at that cabin every week for 2 years, hoping you'd come back so I could explain." Jake watched as Elizabeth's knee seemed to buckle. Thomas stepped forward and caught her arm, steadying her. The simple touch seemed to break down the last of her defenses, and she began to cry. Quiet tears that spoke of 2 years of suppressed grief and longing. "I thought," she whispered, "I thought you'd chosen someone else. I thought everything between us was a lie." "Never," Thomas said fiercely. "You were the only truth in my life, the only thing that mattered. When you left, it nearly destroyed me." Jake felt tears prick his own eyes as he watched Thomas and Elizabeth stand together on that Chicago street. 2 years of pain and misunderstanding finally giving way to truth. Other pedestrians moved around them, but the couple seemed to exist in their own world. "I built the ranch," Thomas continued. "Everything I promised you. It's beautiful, Elizabeth. Rolling hills, good water, room for cattle and horses, and—" He paused, his voice breaking. "Room for the children we talked about." Elizabeth looked up at him, searching his face. "You never married? In all this time? How could I marry someone else when my heart belonged to you? I knew you were alive somewhere, Knew that someday I'd find you and make things right. Jake realized he was witnessing something sacred, the moment when two hearts that belonged together finally found their way back to each other. But he also noticed the curious stares of passers-by and knew this reunion needed privacy. He crossed the street and approached the couple carefully. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "but you might want to continue this conversation somewhere more private." Thomas looked up, his face radiant with joy and gratitude. "Elizabeth, this is Jake Morrison. He's the one who found your diary, who convinced me we could find you." Elizabeth turned to Jake, her eyes still shining with tears. "You helped him search for me? Why?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Because some love stories deserve a happy ending, ma'am. And because Thomas here refused to give up on you." Elizabeth studied Jake's face with the penetrating gaze of an educated woman. "There's more to it than that, isn't there?" Jake found himself unable to lie to those intelligent eyes. "Your diary. Your words reminded me what it means to believe in love. I wanted to help you find your way back to each other." Elizabeth smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her. "Then you've given us the greatest gift imaginable." Over the next hour, in the privacy of Elizabeth's small apartment near the academy, Jake watched as Thomas and Elizabeth pieced together the misunderstanding that had cost them 2 years of happiness. Elizabeth read Thomas's letters with tears streaming down her face, while Thomas held her diary like a precious relic. "I never stopped loving you," Elizabeth whispered as she finished the last letter. "Not for a single day. But I was so hurt, so convinced that I'd been a fool to believe in fairy tales." Thomas took her hands in his, calloused from years of ranch work, but gentle in their touch. "We're not fairy tale people, Elizabeth. We're real people who made real mistakes and suffered real consequences. But our love is real too, and it's strong enough to survive anything, even 2 years of separation and misunderstanding." As Jake watched them together, he felt a bittersweet mixture of joy and loneliness. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do, reunited two hearts that belonged together. But seeing their happiness only emphasized his own solitude. "I should go," Jake said quietly, standing to leave. "You two have a lot to talk about." "Wait," Elizabeth said, rising gracefully from her chair. "Mr. Morrison, I can't let you leave without properly thanking you. You've traveled hundreds of miles to help 2 strangers. That kind of kindness is rare in this world." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Thomas said firmly. "What you did was extraordinary. You saw something worth saving, and you fought for it when we'd both given up hope." Elizabeth moved to a small writing desk in the corner of her apartment and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I keep a journal of my students' progress," she explained, "but I also write observations about life, about human nature." She pulled out several pages covered with her elegant handwriting. "I wrote this last week, before I knew Thomas was looking for me." She cleared her throat and began to read. "There are moments when I wonder if true love is merely a creation of poets and dreamers, a beautiful impossibility that gives us hope but ultimately disappoints. I watch my students read romantic literature with starry eyes, and I want to warn them that real life rarely matches the stories we tell ourselves. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments, I remember how it felt to believe that love could conquer any obstacle. I remember Thomas's hands on my face as he promised we'd build a life together, and I wonder if I gave up too easily on something that was worth fighting for." Elizabeth looked up at Jake. "You believed in our love when we couldn't believe in it ourselves. You fought for our happiness when we'd stopped fighting. That makes you a hero in my eyes, Mr. Morrison." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm no hero, ma'am. I'm just a man who got tired of seeing good things go to waste." "What will you do now?" Thomas asked. "Your cattle are probably scattered to the 4 winds by now." Jake managed a rueful smile. "I'll round them up. It's what I do." "Come back to Wyoming with us," Elizabeth said suddenly. "Both of you belong there. Thomas has his ranch, and well, I suppose I need to decide what comes next." Thomas turned to her, with hope blazing in his eyes. "Does that mean you'll come home with me? Will you marry me, Elizabeth?" Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, then smiled with a radiance that transformed her entire face. "I've been ready to marry you for 2 years, Thomas Brennan. I just needed to find my way back to believing it was possible." Thomas swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small apartment while she laughed, a sound of pure joy that Jake hadn't heard in her voice before. When Thomas finally set her down, they were both breathless and grinning like children. "We'll be married as soon as we get back to Wyoming," Thomas declared. "I won't risk losing you again." "What about the academy?" Jake asked practically. "Don't you have obligations here?" Elizabeth's expression grew thoughtful. "I do, but Miss Porter has been trying to convince me to take a position at her sister school in Denver. She says the mountain air would be good for my constitution." She smiled mischievously. "I think she's noticed that I haven't been entirely happy here." "Denver's only a day's ride from Medicine Bow," Thomas said eagerly. "You could teach there if you wanted to keep working." "Actually," Elizabeth said slowly, "I've been thinking about starting a school of my own, a place where frontier children could get a proper education without having to leave their families. There's such a need for it in Wyoming." Jake watched the excitement build between them as they planned their future together. Their happiness was infectious, but it also highlighted his own uncertain path. He'd spent 6 weeks helping them find each other. Now he had to figure out what came next for himself. The next morning, the three of them boarded a westbound train. Elizabeth had given her notice at the academy and arranged for her belongings to be shipped to Wyoming. Thomas was practically vibrating with excitement, unable to sit still as the train carried them toward home. "Jake," Elizabeth said during a quiet moment while Thomas dozed in his seat, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. You mentioned that my diary reminded you what it means to believe in love. Does that mean you've given up on finding it yourself?" Jake stared out the train window at the passing landscape. "I thought I had. Got my heart broken a couple years back and decided it wasn't worth the risk. But now," Jake was quiet for a long moment, "now I think maybe I was wrong. Watching you and Thomas, seeing how you found your way back to each other despite everything, it makes me think that maybe some risks are worth taking." Elizabeth smiled gently. "The right woman is out there, Mr. Morrison. Someone who will appreciate your loyalty and kindness. Don't give up on love just because it didn't work out the first time." "How do you know the right woman exists?" "Because I've seen your heart," Elizabeth replied. "Any man who would travel across half the country to reunite two strangers has a heart worth loving. You just need to find someone worthy of it." 2 days later, they arrived in Cheyenne. Thomas immediately began making arrangements for their wedding, while Elizabeth marveled at how much the territory had grown since she'd left. Jake found himself reluctant to leave them, but he knew they needed time alone to rebuild their relationship. "Stay for the wedding," Thomas insisted as Jake prepared to collect his horse and continue his journey. "It's only 3 days away, and you're the reason it's happening at all." "I'd be honored," Jake replied, and meant it. The wedding took place at the small church in Medicine Bow, with most of the town in attendance. Elizabeth wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and Thomas looked prouder than any man had a right to be. As Jake watched them exchange vows, he felt a deep satisfaction in knowing he'd helped make this moment possible. But it was during the reception that Jake's own life took an unexpected turn. He was standing alone near the edge of the celebration, watching Thomas and Elizabeth dance, when a woman approached him. She was probably in her late 20s, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes, wearing a practical but well-made dress. "You must be Jake Morrison," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Sarah Chun. I teach at the school here. I took over Elizabeth's position when she left." Jake tipped his hat. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Chun." "I wanted to thank you," she continued. "Elizabeth told me how you helped her and Thomas find each other again. It's the most romantic story I've ever heard." "Just did what needed doing," Jake replied, though he found himself studying her face with interest. There was something about her directness and warmth that appealed to him. "Elizabeth also mentioned that you're considering staying in the area instead of continuing your wandering. Is that true?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. Elizabeth had been matchmaking, apparently. "I haven't decided yet. Depends on whether there's work to be found." As it happens, the school board has been discussing the need for someone to help with the older boys, someone who could teach them practical skills alongside their regular studies. The position would include a small cabin and a decent salary. Jake looked at her more closely. "You're offering me a job, Miss Chin? I'm suggesting you might consider it. The town needs good men, Mr. Morrison, men who understand loyalty and commitment." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "And I could use someone to help me start that advanced school Elizabeth was talking about." As the evening wound down and the celebration began to disperse, Jake found himself in deep conversation with Sarah Chun about education, about the challenges facing frontier communities, and about the possibility of building something lasting in Wyoming Territory. When Thomas and Elizabeth prepared to leave for their honeymoon trip to Denver, Elizabeth pulled Jake aside. "I see you've met Sarah," she said with a knowing smile. "She seems like a fine woman." Jake replied carefully. "She is. She's also been alone too long, just like you have. Sometimes the best things in life happen when we stop looking so hard and start paying attention to what's right in front of us." Jake watched as Thomas helped Elizabeth into their buggy, both of them glowing with happiness. "You think I should stay?" "I think you should follow your heart," Elizabeth replied. "It led you to us when we needed help most. Maybe now it's time to let it lead you to your own happiness." 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the same church where he'd watched Thomas and Elizabeth exchange vows, waiting for his own bride to walk down the aisle. Sarah Chun had agreed to marry him after a courtship that was both practical and deeply romantic. Two people who understood the value of partnership, of shared dreams and mutual respect. As Sarah appeared at the back of the church, radiant in her wedding dress, Jake thought about the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A storm, an abandoned cabin, a diary full of another woman's dreams. All of it had led him here, to his own chance at happiness. Thomas Brennan stood as Jake's best man, grinning broadly as he watched his friend prepare to take the same leap of faith that had brought him such joy. Elizabeth sat in the front pew, her own happiness evident as she watched the man who'd reunited her with her true love find his own path to contentment. After the ceremony, as Jake and Sarah danced under the Wyoming stars, Elizabeth approached with a small wrapped package. "A wedding gift," she explained as Sarah unwrapped it carefully. Inside was Elizabeth's original diary, the one Jake had found in the cabin. "I want you to have this," Elizabeth said. "It started the journey that brought all of us together. Maybe someday you'll pass it on to someone else who needs to believe in love's possibilities." Sarah looked at the diary with reverence, understanding its significance. "Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll treasure it." As the evening celebration continued around them, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since that stormy night when he'd sought shelter in a lonely cabin. He'd been a man running from disappointment, convinced that love was too risky, too painful to pursue. Now he was a husband, a teacher, a member of a community that valued his contributions. He'd found not just love, but purpose, helping to build the kind of school that would give frontier children opportunities their parents had never had. But perhaps most importantly, he'd learned that some risks were not only worth taking, they were essential to becoming the person he was meant to be. The wind whispered across the Wyoming plains, carrying the sound of laughter and music from the wedding celebration. In a cabin 20 miles away, Thomas had left fresh flowers and a note for any traveler who might seek shelter there, a tradition he and Elizabeth had established to honor the place where their love story had been preserved until the right person came along to help it reach its proper conclusion. Jake Morrison, the lone cowboy who'd found a diary and discovered that love was worth fighting for, danced with his bride under an endless canopy of stars, grateful for storms that force us to seek shelter, for mysteries that demand solutions, and for the courage to believe that some endings are really just the beginning of something even more beautiful. As the celebration wound down and the newly married couples prepared to begin their lives together, Elizabeth whispered to Sarah, "Keep writing in that diary. Keep believing in love's possibilities. You never know who might need to find those words someday." Sarah nodded solemnly, understanding that she was now the keeper of a tradition, a chronicler of hope for future hearts that might need reminding that true love, while never easy, is always worth the journey. The Wyoming wind carried their laughter across the plains, a sound of pure joy that spoke to the enduring truth that love, like the vast frontier itself, offers endless possibilities to those brave enough to explore them. 10 years later, the cabin at Silver Creek had become something of a legend in Wyoming Territory. Travelers knew they could find shelter there, along with a guest book where visitors could leave their own stories of love, loss, and hope. The diary that started it all remained in Sarah Morrison's keeping, shared with students who needed to believe that their dreams were possible. Thomas and Elizabeth Brennan's school had grown into one of the finest educational institutions in the territory, producing teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders who carried the values of the frontier: courage, determination, and faith in human possibility into the rapidly changing world. Jake and Sarah Morrison raised 3 children who grew up believing that love was not just a fairy tale, but a choice, a daily decision to build something beautiful with another person, even when the storms of life threatened to tear it apart. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the cottonwoods around Silver Creek, local residents claimed they could still hear the echo of laughter from that long-ago wedding celebration, a reminder that some love stories are too powerful to be contained by time, too meaningful to be forgotten, and too beautiful to be anything but eternal. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.